Hello, everybody. Welcome back to episode 9 of Life, the Complete Story. As always, I'm your host, Tyler, joined by my lovely co-host, Alex. Say hi, Alex.
Hello, everybody. Welcome back once again to Life, the Complete Story. Today's episode, we're getting a little further along the phylogenetic tree as we run through all of our groupings. We're getting a little more advanced with each time. So today, our lesson for today is going to be on the phylum Annelida, or the annelids, which are segmented worms. So think like earthworms. But first, as always, we're going to start with our nature in the news.
Correctamundo. Today's Nature in the News comes from Science Daily, which is rapid oyster reef restoration gives hope for repairing the sea. Basically, this is an article, more like a research paper, where we have kind of made a man-made reef off the coast of Australia, off that southern coast. The University of Adelaide had installed 14 limestone boulder reefs, so I'd assume that they kind of set up the groundwork for this reef before planting them in the ocean, so there's a little bit of stability thing there.
Yeah, usually they build up big limestone boulders up, and then over the water line build kind of. Well, it depends if they're barriers or like just the reefs. They kind of just drop boulders until it kind of forms that reef zone.
Right. So this project started in 2020 in fall, winter, late time. So fall, winter for us in the U.S., but for them it's their spring and summer because the hemispheres.
Correct.
And in 2.5 years, so early 2023, late 22, yeah, now
It had been
mid 2023, they had recovered to a near marine metropolis, we'll say.
Yeah, that's the quote from the article by Dr. Dominic McAfee.
Right. So this article was published by McAfee, McLeod, Carruthers, and Connell. This was a research article published in SER, the Society for Ecological Restoration, or the Journal of the Society of Ecological Restoration.
Okay.
We're not going to get too in-depth in the article. We're really going to focus on this Science Daily article. They have observed densities of native adult flat oysters that exceed densities on the Tasmanian natural reef. So we're talking southern coast of Australia, and then Tasmania is a smaller island off the coast of Australia that has a natural reef, and we're saying that these densities are greater at this artificial reef that we made in 2020 than the natural reef that's been there for centuries.
Fantastic.
Not to mention that where we put this reef has been basically decimated ecologically for the past century because of trade routes and all of that. So we're finally getting to rebuild some ecosystem.
Yeah, like rehabilitating.
Right. And part of this, what makes it so amazing is the fact that you're putting a new reef in an area that's been desolate for a century, and the recovery, like the bounce back that these populations have is incredible, because you're taking something that hasn't had these reefs for over a century, and now all these coils are coming back, these oysters are coming back, and the macroinvertebrates and everything like that live in these areas are showing population growth as well.
Fantastic, yeah. Saying the rate of recovery, one of the quotes from the article, the rate of recovery of this benthic ecosystem demonstrates the latent resilience of degraded oyster communities and the capacity for effective marine restorations to achieve a rapid ecological recovery. So they're saying things like this sort of these artificial reefs are great ways to boost degraded ecosystems. They said communities of these sorts of macroinvertebrates are about 60% of the biodiversity on healthy reef systems like the ones they use for reference, and they're increasing in those ecological functions that they serve, such as filter feeding. A lot of, as when we get into a later episode, we'll talk a lot about especially the bivalves, so like clams, oysters. They filter feed a lot, and that helps really clean up a lot of junk, per se. That's an easy way to put it. Like that, those small particles that are in the water kind of make it cloudy, things like that. They help filter a lot of it out. Um, and like Tyler said before, a lot of human activities such as seafloor dredging, trade routes, things like that, destroy a lot of these communities, these reef communities. But rebuilding some of these habitats has shown to increase that exponentially. So the one quote here is, globally, 85% of oyster reefs have been lost, and on many coastlines, these ecosystems were nearly obliterated.
So, I have pulled up the actual article from, what did I say? Society for Ecological Rehabilitation.
Okay.
And for our video listeners, if you direct your attention to this map, obviously it shows some imaging, what these reefs look like. This bottom picture here, you can see the big boulders that they've kind of installed. This red diamond on the map is actually where these are located. And these 3 blue diamonds represent other reefs that we use as a type of reference site. So comparing our new artificial reef to these natural reference reefs. And
I do like that it kind of looks like a chromosome. I don't know
it
if that
does
was
kind of look like a
purposeful. I
chromosome.
just noticed that. I couldn't. It was distracting me. I had to say that. It's kind of cool the way they laid that out. I'm sure there's definitely a rhyme and reason to why they laid it out that way, but
One thing
cannot
you'll
say for
notice
sure.
though, as you look at this map more, this striped region is the Adelaide metropolis of Australia. So you can see just how close this is to like an actual like urban area.
Yeah, it looks like a big like marina kind of like boat docking area.
Right.
And that top picture, I mean, that's close. It's very close to probably a very busy boating area.
Absolutely. Let me show some more graphs and representation here so you guys can get a visual idea of what's going on. First, we'll start with this little circle graph. I don't really know it's not really a pie graph. But you can see this first circle here is a baseline. So when the reefs were installed, versus 2.5 years later, how much things have increased. Obviously, the green is the level it's at. So the further outside the circle it is, the better off you are in that category. So we've turned overutilization has been a peak forever, but after these 2.5 years, you're seeing more species composition. You're seeing more positioning policies. You're seeing more productivity in the ecosystem, a lot more resiliency in the ecosystem because it's been there for 2.5 years. You've been able to get these stable populations back. It's kind of like we talk about it a lot in ecology whenever you have a new like old growth forest versus new growth forest, like the what's the word I'm thinking of, Alex?
Secession.
Yes, secession. So you're seeing like a type of secession almost where,
or succession, I guess.
Yes, succession where early ecosystem players come in at first, kind of develop the reef more, which brings bigger and better things into the ecosystem and kind of breathes new life into it.
Correct. Yeah, and of course you can see there's some things that may not be necessarily good, like you see an increase in invasive species, but at the same, like sedimentation, so you're getting more of like that sediment settling, building up. But I mean that's to be expected as you get something that's going to catch some of that sediment. And while the invasive species didn't go up much, it looks like it only went up one level, which I mean any increase in invasive species isn't great, but compared to all of the other, how much it increased across the rest of the chart there. As far as especially like that ecosystem function, kind of how I mean that was all at zeros at the baseline, and it just is mess. It's up to threes and fours out of fives for um, especially the resilience and recruitment, the fact that it's actually sustaining itself and kind of expanding itself. You're going to see some invasive species as you get more biodiversity, more space for all those species across the board. So I think that may be one of those acceptable, like an acceptable loss sort of thing.
Yeah, it's a tolerance because you're getting so
Yeah,
much more species diversity within the ecosystem itself that you'll take the small increase in invasives.
correct.
We'll go on to the next graphic here. This is a chart displaying not only oyster density but also species richness in two separate graphs. Obviously, as a baseline, there were no oysters in this reef because it was just installed. But as you can see, post-restoration, this 2.5 years later, you're having almost 200 oysters per square meter, if I'm reading this correctly,
Yes.
which topples the reference reef for what we use for these oysters, which only had about 125 oysters per square meter. And once again, not quite in the species richness chart, not quite where the other reference reefs are, but they've been here for
Yeah,
however many years.
yeah, it's hard to um, keep up with a reef that's been established for so long. You're going to get a bit more biodiversity for a longer established reef. But in just 2.5 years, um, how much it has increased from the baseline is a significant boost in species richness.
Right. I don't know how big a transect is. That's more of a surveying thing that we haven't really done in our careers. But we're going from looks like a quarter of a species per transect up to almost 9 species per transect. So that's 9 separate species in each of these transects identified. The article itself has a couple pictures of what the reef looks like now. But I think that's going to wrap up our nature in the news section for this week. Very exciting stuff going on in the world. And we'll move on into our lesson. Alex, would you like to kick us off today?
Yeah, so as I started earlier, we are talking about our annelids, the phylum Annelida or Annelidae,
Which
depending on
concludes our 3-part segment of worms. And of course, we're
correct.
finishing our last segment with the segmented worms.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, so that's our segmented worms. These are it's a fairly diverse grouping. These are the most complex of the worm groups of the worm phyla. We have about 22,000 species, including the ragworms, earthworms, which is what most people are familiar with, as well as leeches. So they can be found in many different places, tidal pools, down into hydrothermal vents in the ocean, freshwater, and of course terrestrial environments like your earthworms. Um, they do exhibit bilateral symmetry, which is something that we talked about before, is pretty characteristic of your more advanced species. You split them down the middle, usually long ways, and they're symmetrical on one side to the other. And they are triploblastic coelomates. So they actually have, we talked about a week or two ago, um, your different levels of like membranes within the body. They have 3 layers, and they have a true coelom, which is that like the gut is actually
Yeah, it's the internal
separated.
body cavity.
Correct. Yeah. So the organs, at the very least, the gut is actually separated by. Of course, there's the membrane that's actually the gut tissue, and then there's a membrane around that, and then the body cavity. So I think that's the easiest way to describe that. So these, as we said, more advanced. Before we've talked about like the acoelomates or the pseudocoelomates, where they don't have that extra membrane, or they sort of do, but it's really not anything like it's not a true separation of that gut organ within the body. So Tyler, if you want to get into our traditional classification of what the
Right.
annelids are.
So the and these invertebrates, as we're learning about, they're kind of getting revamped in their classification. We've been using a very traditional like physiological differences to separate our species. Now we're getting more into cladistics, like how they interact with their environments and how similar they are to each other,
as well as genetics.
as well as genetics. But
Playing a big part.
for the sake of this, we're going traditional because there's a lot further classifications in the cladistic view versus the traditional view. So in a traditional view, there are two separate classes in this phylum. There is the Polychaeta.
Kita.
Yeah, that's the word. We'll get into what the Cheetah is later on down the line today, as well as the Clitolata, right? Clitolata.
Yeah, I think Clitolata.
So we'll first we're going to cover the polychaetes,
yes.
which are bristleworms. They are primarily marine, although we have found some in freshwater and terrestrial environments. They have segments. These segments have chetae, which are chitinous bristles that are found on fleshy protrusions around the body called parapodia. So para means kind of what does para mean in Latin? I'm blanking here. But poda means feet.
Para is like alongside, like near, kind of like resembling. So like
Okay, so
resembling feet.
Because I almost said pseudopoda, but that's not right. Because pseudopoda means fake feet. There have been over 10,000 species of these polychaetes described. Anatomically, they have a thin epithelium covered by a cuticle, which houses a thick layer of muscle and a body cavity. So that's that triploblastic anatomy that we were talking about earlier. They have a peristomium, which is where the mouth itself is located. But in front of that, they have a protostomium, which is kind of like this like proboscis type thing in front of the mouth that kind of covers it and protects it more.
Yeah, so I shared here a picture of what our bristle worms look like. So you can see those little, sort of like the little chitinous
the
protrusion, the little cilia. So chitin is a protein that's like a hardened protein molecule. It kind of forms like those stiff. So when we get to the arthropods later on, a lot of them use chitin for their shells. So it's different than the calcium carbonate shells that we've talked about in the past for a couple of different things.
Right. So these are more hardened and so if Alex could please highlight, if he could. I don't know if he can move his mouse around on it. But you'll see along the outside, those are parapodia and chetae, and towards the anterior end of the worm, there we go.
Yeah.
The anterior, yes.
Yeah.
You can see the peristomium, which is that out in front bit, and then a protostomia, which is where the mouth is actually housed. So underneath of that would be the mouth. Most larger species have external gills found within the parapodia, so within those bristles are some external gills.
And it's kind of what looks like these white protrusions here near the head almost look like those external gills.
Right. And they help the organism breathe. So gills are a evolutionary trait that allows organisms to kind of obtain oxygen through the water without diffusing it through their skin.
So it's a bit more efficient than just diffusion through the body membranes.
Correct. They have a simple circulatory system comprised of 2 blood vessels, but they don't have a heart because these are contractile vessels, so they pump the blood itself using these vessels. There is no need for a heart per se. And some more notable species, Alex, if you could please pull these up as I explain them.
Yes, sir.
The Pompeii worm, which is named based off of its discovery close to these hydrothermal vents. Pompeii, historically, is a city that was next to a volcano, and the volcano erupted, encasing all of the citizens in that lava. So that's why they get their name. They live close to hydrothermal vents, which are basically tiny underground volcanoes that don't spit lava. I'm waiting for Alex to pull a picture, and we will move in.
There we go. That is a Pompeii worm.
So you can see the Kite, those little green like for our video listeners, there's green like hairs along the backside of the worm. You can see those external gills of those bright orange things towards the anterior end. We'll move on to and these are found around hydrothermal vents deep underwater in the benthic zone. We'll move into our next species, Hesiocisa methaneocola, which lives on methane shale, I want to say. So it feeds off methane rather than actual organisms. That's how it obtains its nutrients, just through these methane rocks. Nothing too special. Follows a similar pattern to most other bristleworms. Next is the bobbit worm.
These guys are freaky.
Bobbit worms are very freaky. They live in the sediment of their habitat. So they dig, yeah, as the picture shows, it's a bit small, but we can still use it to describe.
Let me zoom in here.
Hopefully. There we go. You can see it kind of lives in the sediment and pops its head up and feeds that way. And it kind of snags things out of the air and pulls it back in to feed. And last is the Dimorpheus Dryrocellatus, which nothing too special, but it has some of the most extreme sexual dimorphism known in this kind of class here. The females, both individuals are small. Both genders are small. The females measuring about 1 millimeter long and have a more simplified body. Yeah, close enough.
Yeah, I mean shows the male and female. That's kind of the best. Unfortunately, that was one of the better pictures I was able to find.
Yeah, so
for
on
this.
the left side of these diagrams is the female worm. It's about 1 millimeter long. And the right one is the male. As you can see, comparatively, the male is more like a chicken nugget, and the female is the chicken tender. That's about as good as we're gonna get there for this.
I mean, hey, it works, doesn't
yeah,
it?
you're comparing a millimeter worm to a 50 micrometer worm.
Very small.
A couple hundred cells, they say, and they don't have a digestive system, and they only have a couple neurons in their nervous system, and they live for about a week. So that's and unlike other worms, polychaetes are hermaphrodites. Not hermaphrodites. I lied. They have separate sexes. They are dimorphous, as we just talked about in the worm prior to.
Yeah.
So they have a gonad in every segment in the most primitive species, but they do have specialization in the larger, more advanced species.
There are distinct males and females.
Yes. And they fertilize externally, so the females will shed their eggs. They don't exactly release them, they kind of shed them off their segments. And then the males will also shed their sperm. And it kind of floats and connects, and that's external fertilization in a nutshell for these polychaetes.
Yeah.
That's all I have for this grouping.
Okay.
There's a load of families and orders that they fall into. We're not going to cover those because there's
a lot.
Yes. And they're mostly paraphyletic, so they all kind of look the same.
Okay. Nice. Yeah. So then moving on to our other class, at least our traditional class, is Clitolata. So these are pretty much the other segmented worms that we haven't talked about. So like your earthworms, your leeches. So they're characterized by the clitellum, which is like a collar that forms a cocoon for reproduction. So on earthworms, most folks are familiar. If you've seen an earthworm, they have that kind of longer section on the body.
Thicker too.
Longer, thicker. It's like a smooth section. That is the clitellum, that like collar structure. That is what they use for reproduction. They do not have a parapoda. They do not have parapoda, so that you do not see the small little foot-like structures on them, and their head is typically less developed. They don't have a distinct head, especially when you looked at like the bobbit worm. It had a very clear head segment. And then the mouth, of course, the mouth is behind the prostomium, so they still have that kind of outer and inner mouth. However, brain is not part of the head. Since they don't have a head, it's usually located in a body segment. Now, it's still located towards what would be the front of the worm, but that is still considered a body segment rather than a separate head. The clitellum is it's actually multiple body segments that are modified to either house the gonopores, like the locate where the sexual cells, the reproductive cells are
where the
released
gametes
from.
exist.
Yes, where the gametes exist, or is located like directly behind them. So like the segment before that is where they're located, and then behind that is kind of where they are released to before fertilization. Typically, they lack eyes, but they will have photoreceptors. So they'll have receptors that are sensitive to light, so that way they can still orient themselves. Especially those that are either aquatic, they need to kind of orient where up and down is, so they look for the light of the sun. They still do have the chetae, but they are just small bristles located in like 4 little bundles on each of the segments. They use those to move, so they use them for locomotion by extending and contracting the body, so they can extend and contract those segments to move through, like especially earthworms, they move through the soil.
Yeah. Can we pause there? We can kind of distinguish locomotion between, as we said, this is the third grouping of worms we've talked about, so we can kind of distinguish worms based on their type of locomotion. So a roundworm kind of wibble wobbles, like it can't control, so it just kind of wibble wobbles like I don't know how to describe it, like a sine wave almost.
Yeah. They kind of just flail.
Yeah. Platyhelminths, those flatworms, they kind of, what do? They kind of like undulate, right?
Yeah.
Since they're flatter, wider organisms, they kind of undulate, kind of like a sea slug almost. Is probably one of the better comparisons we can make for that.
Yeah.
And these annelids we're talking about, these ones in specific, can kind of crawl-ish per se.
Yeah.
They use their cilia to pull forward, contract, like an inchworm, but not as severe in terms of like a contraction.
Yeah, they don't contract like up and down. It's just a straight in the line,
Yeah.
or they can
Forward.
move left and right, but typically it's just that straight in line. They contract forward, so they'll kind of expand their segment, use those chitinous bristles to kind of grab on a little bit, and then contract the rear segments, and then continue.
Yep.
Use the bristles to anchor in the back, push forward, and just continue that motion. It's kind of a similar like how a train is, where it's just moves forward.
Pushing forward as
yes.
these chetae do. We'll move into the order Hierodinida, which is the leeches. Leeches are flattened segmented worms, so they have a taper at both ends, both the mouth end and the anus end. They are fixed at 33 segments, so these other orders don't exactly have that. They can kind of, their segments are basically their growth patterns, so you can kind of like rings on a tree, but not really. You can tell how old or how big it is based off the segments. Leeches are stuck at 33 segments no matter what. However, you cannot see these segments because they have a cuticle marked with annulations. That cuticle kind of covers that epidermis, so you can't see the segments.
I believe don't all, or at least all of the clitollates have a cuticle. So it's like a
all segmented worms
all
have
segment.
cuticle.
Okay.
Yes, even the rest of worms do.
So it's like sort of like a waxy covering that's on the outer layer of this of that like surface like
the
skin.
epidermis.
Yeah, the epidermis.
Yeah. It's excreted through the epidermis too.
Correct. Yeah, it's just a waxy layer, helps protect them.
Right.
Kind of prevents severe water loss, things like that.
Yep. They don't have chetae.
The leeches do not.
Yeah, they're kind of smooth in that regard. The front segments around the mouth end have been modified to form a sucker. So if you don't know what a leech is, Alex, would you please pull up a picture of a leech while I explain?
Yes, sir.
They are parasitic worms that attach to their host through the sucker, and they are what would you say the word is? Hemo. There's bloodsuckers,
Correct.
so they're
Yeah.
like hemophiles.
Yes. Yeah, and they when they bite, so like leeches that attach to humans, especially in their mouth, they produce a chemical with hyrudine, I believe it is called. Which is where they get the name of their subclass.
Is that
That
like an anticoagulant or?
correct? Yeah, it increases the bleeding rate of the whatever that it bites. So since they use the blood as nutrients. I don't know why my pictures are showing up so small today. I apologize. That is your leech. So you can see towards the head a little bit, some of those segments are a little bit more pronounced, but as it gets further back, kind of more the main portion of the body, you can see there that they start to smooth out a little bit. Now, I'm not sure if I can get a picture here of kind of what the mouth looks like. Kind of, there we go. That one might be a decent picture. Let me share this tab. Here we go. So this here, kind of see the mouth. It's just like a sucker, and the actual mouth, blood-sucking mouth parts are just right kind of there near the center of the leech. It's hard to see. You can see some of them get very large, like this one here. Got quite large in comparison to a man's arm. So yeah, very very interesting. Like you said, that hyrudine is where they get their name from in different pictures. Yeah, that clotting abilities that what we're talking about, that protein or that chemical causes the blood to thin, making it easier to get it from whatever it is feeding off of.
Right. And unlike the Polychaetae, the Clitellata are all hermaphroditic. So we talked about sexual dimorphism with polychaetes and just being dioecious in general. Clitellata are all hermaphrodites, which means that they have both they have both male and female gametes
Correct.
within themselves. That'll conclude our lesson for the day. Correct? Correct.
Looks like it.
We will move into our recurring segments. We have Alex. Let's kick us off. Let's kick it off with our most wanted for the day.
Yeah. So our most wanted for today is an invasive species. Of course, it is called the jumping worm. Kind of a different one. So these are, of course, annelids. These last few weeks, I've been trying to find invasive species of the grouping that we're talking about. So these are the Asian jumping worm. The scientific name is Amanthus agrestis, also known as Alabama jumpers, Jersey regulars, wood eels, crazy worms, snake worms, or crazy snake worms. They're called jumping worms because the way they move, they kind of flip themselves pretty violently to the point where they can kind of flop off the ground about a foot high or so. Like many other earthworms, they do eat pieces of fallen leaves, kind of other detritus, that upper layer of the forest soil on forest floors. However, they eat many different things, not just a lot of that detritus. They'll eat some like roots, things like that. Pretty much wherever there's some sort of like plant, trying to think like plant tissue. But mainly your fallen kind of decaying leaves is where they where they focus. However, of course, worms are a very important part of soil ecosystems. They help aerate soils, make it more useful for plants by allowing oxygen to enter in the soil and make it more available to root systems. But they they do cause problems with that because of how they're able to outcompete a lot of native earthworms. Of course, they look very similar to your typical earthworm.
Yeah, I was about to ask you, how can you tell the difference between this and your
I believe
normal?
that's the problem. It's very hard to tell.
Like the only thing I can think of is the size of the clitellum. Like when I see a normal earthworm in PA, it's got a little bit bigger of a band.
Correct.
But then again, I don't also look at earthworms very often.
Yeah, that is true. It doesn't say specifically in this article that I'm looking at how specifically they impact the ecosystem other than outcompeting native worms, I'm guessing, just because of how much they can eat. They cause problems that way. And it's very easy. That most likely they came over in potted plants that were imported and have since been released. They escaped and have caused problems in that in the areas they've been introduced. And it's saying here that fortunately earthworms don't move very fast. Now these ones, like I said, because of the way they move, they can kind of jump. Um, they move a little bit better than our native earthworms. However, the best way to stop it, of course, is to do the best to avoid moving them around, especially far distances. Kind of keeps them from spreading too far.
Gotcha. Now, do these have like a USDA, like you just Department of Agriculture, like halt? Like if you see them, don't move them out of the restricted area?
Not that I have found. I'm trying to see if I can find another kind of something else that helps kind of expand on that. So, okay, so something kind of why they're such a problem is because they live so close to the soil surface. They eat a lot of that organic layer that plants use, causing it to kind of disappear, making it less of course, all those nutrients less available to the plants, just kind of destroying the
Ecosystem.
the soil itself, preventing plant growth, and that's why they're such a problem as because they're invasive. So they say, yeah, I mean, if you like, I'm sure as many, yeah, here's some of those stops. Like, um, sometimes they can be sold as bait for fishing. Like we use worms for fishing, or use it doing what's called vermicomposting, or composting using worms. However, it is highly, I don't know if there's a halt specifically on that. In some cases where there's a real problem, I'm sure there is. Uh, but yeah, the biggest thing, don't purchase them for those purposes, because it allows them a way to access the environment, and be very careful when sharing like nursery material, plant material, especially exotic plants that were imported,
Gotcha.
or those that from areas that are infested with these jumping worms to non-infested areas. So things like mulch, topsoil, compost, even plants themselves.
Okay. Understood. All right. Does that conclude your most
That
wanted for the week?
that it does.
All right. So I didn't follow the instructions and pick an annelid for my amazing species,
That's
partially because I don't really think there's that many that are endangered.
not compared to our most of our other to many other species that we've looked at.
Right. So what I did was I went on the IUCN Red List website. I went to the amazing species category like I always do. And I clicked on the second one, which so happens to be one of my favorite mammal species ever. Well, they're oftentimes the ghosts of the forest, if that kind of gives you guys a hint as to what it is. They're not exactly well known per se in like a common, like if I ask somebody on the street what this was, they probably wouldn't know. But if you're on the inside, you know what it is. It's the okapi. The scientific name, Okapi johnstini. For those of you that don't know what it is, Alex, if you could please pull a picture while I
Absolutely.
kind of explain why it's so amazing. All right. So, yes, perfect. They're kind of this mishmash of a whole bunch of different things. So they have like the legs of a zebra, the body of a horse, which is basically a zebra, so I don't know why I made that. Besides, it doesn't have stripes. And the neck of a giraffe. They're actually the giraffe's closest living relative right now.
Yeah, they're in the same family.
Mm-hmm. So, with that being said, the okapi has an extant range in the forests of the Democratic Republic of the Congo, DRC for short, and it had a former range that extended out into Uganda off to the east of DRC. They live in the forests of the region, and they are listed as endangered. So as I kind of do more and more research in the IUCN, I understand more and more how they classify things. So we've gone over a couple critically endangered species over the past couple weeks. That means that there's an 80% loss in habitat and species and population over the past 3 generations. The threshold to be endangered is 50% population decrease in 3 generations. And a generation length in the okapi is 8 years, so not too long. And a generation, as we've stated, is not the lifespan of these organisms. It's from birth until reproductive age.
Yeah. Yeah. So once they reach that sexual maturity that they themselves can produce offspring, that's that's that generation.
Right.
And then thus they can produce the next generation. It's basically how that works is how long it takes for them to be able to produce another generation.
So this most recent assessment of the okapi took place in 2015 and was published in 2015. So it's 2024. We're probably going to need a new update sooner rather than later on these okapi because, as you know, the world is constantly changing, and I'd like to know if these are going up or down. They have some previous assessments dating back to 1996 where they were listed as near threatened. In 2008, they were again near threatened. And in 2013, they were endangered. So you can see over time how the population has decreased within those more recent older assessments. Threats to the okapi include urbanization. Humans are evil, and we tend to take up more space than we need to. So we make big cities.
Yeah.
That take out other species because we're more important. Oil and gas mining, because resources are non-renewable in this case, and these are two of the most needed resources in the world.
Correct. Yeah.
Something we haven't really talked about is how war affects these populations, and when you're in a place as kind of
tumultuous
as the DRC, where there's constantly civil war and just
a
government.
lot of unrest. It's a very turbulent part of the world.
Yes, as is Africa as a whole, pretty much.
Yes.
These military exercises and these wars going on kind of affect populations. They're kind of caught in the crossfire here. War doesn't bring anything good.
Especially when it comes to environmental impact, because a lot of destruction is caused, especially that and things that drive war, kind of that sometimes a result of war, like food shortages, things like that. These animals become what is kind of colloquially known as bushmeat, which that kind of not your typical like meat stuffs that we think of, like cattle, goats, sheep, things like that. It's something that is hunted because it is a larger, especially larger mammals. They produce a lot of meat.
But bushmeat can include monkeys too. Like
this is true.
I've watched videos recently on, bringing things back from extinction, and they talked about monkeys being bushmeat.
Correct. Yeah, that's as I said. It's not specific. I shouldn't say it's not specific to these larger mammals, but typically, like your larger organisms, larger comparative to things like your like freshwater fish or like insects, things that are like rodents, like something like medium size, larger,
sustainable.
Yeah.
Contains enough sustenance that it will feed you for the day.
Something that people would consider worth hunting because it gives enough meat.
Yes.
to eat. However, like we said, not things that have a fast things like this, that not something that has a fast enough generation time, um, or it's not something that is traditionally farmed, or like raised for foodstuffs.
Right.
And so this is something now better than other things. It's more of a local use for the food, as well as using the skins of the animal for clothing.
Correct. Um, they're also under threat of agriculture and logging trades, so deforestation, which in turn leads to more farmland.
Correct. Yeah,
And
it
as a,
was like Tyler said, they're called the ghosts of the forest. They live in that forested environment. So as that's lost, they lose habitat. There's less space for the okapi to survive.
yes, and as Alex alluded to, they are used in local apparel and cuisine, not quite on a national level or an international level, but a lot of these tribes and smaller towns do use the okapi for clothing. However, all hope is not lost. They are not in the site's appendices. That's the word. Because they are a national symbol in the Congolese law, so they are protected through law rather than a environmental protection agency. That is because, yeah. Think of them as the equivalent to the DRC as the bald eagle is to the USA.
Yeah, so they kind of placing that much more importance on an animal makes it a lot easier for governments and regulatory bodies to enforce penalties on those who do hunt and kill these organisms, as well as so it makes it easier for them to kind of prosecute through legal channels
Right.
those who target the okapi, and especially being an endangered species, it just raises that level of consequence.
And I don't think we've talked about the site's appendices a lot when we talk about these amazing species, but I don't think we've ever actually gone into like what is CITES. CITES is the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species of Wild Fauna and Flora. So they kind of regulate all this stuff. More or less, it's an agreement between a whole bunch of different nations that say we're going to enforce laws or enforce rules on endangered species being traded and uh, used. And they have different appendices that kind of dictate how important it is. So like it's first, second, third. I don't exactly know what makes one versus the other. I'm sure I can figure that out for a later episode and explain it to you guys. But once again, all hope is not lost. They are protected by the Congolese by their law, as well as they have a couple sanctuaries. So they have the RFO, which is some fancy French term for a park that they live in. I apologize. It's on here. I read it earlier. I lost it now. But they have a national park that's about 10,000 square kilometers.
Is it Maiko? Mako? Maiko?
That's one of the parks. They have the RFO, which is a separate park that I'm forgetting the name of.
And then there's a small population still occurs in the Watalinga Forest in the northern sector of Virunga National Park.
Correct.
So a lot of their habitat is protected area.
I have found what the RFO is actually
Okay.
called. The Reserve des Faune Okapis, or the Okapi Wildlife Reserve. Tricky. Very tricky. But yes, they have those two major parks that have protected populations, large protected populations comparatively, as well as the forest that Alex talked about. And there's a lot of zoos and other sanctuaries internationally that house their own captive okapis, and there's talks in Europe about getting a collective together to kind of
Like a breeding program.
breed and reintroduce. Yes, in Europe. We haven't really gotten there in the U.S. yet, but we're working on it.
Nice.
That's gonna conclude this episode. I think I'm finished my amazing species. You talked about your most wanted. We covered the worms. We finished worms finally.
Yeah.
That's gonna bring us into mollusca next week. Plot twist: we're doing a double feature this week because someone's getting married.
Maybe. No, definitely. Yeah.
Yeah. So we won't be shooting next week. We're gonna be doing a double feature today. Not that you guys care. You're still going to get your episodes weekly at 7 o'clock on our Spotify. And the episode prior will be on YouTube. As always, follow us on Spotify if you haven't already. Subscribe on YouTube. Like and comment. Let us know how we do. Let us know what you want to see next. We can always add segments, take anything out if you don't like it. Follow us on Facebook. Like our page on Facebook. Follow us on Instagram. At Life Complete Story on Instagram, at Life the Complete Story on Facebook. Email us at lifecompletestory@gmail.com if you have a question that we could answer.
We'll
Am I missing anything?
No, I think you got it all. Did rocking and rolling today.
Right. So as always, as we finish our podcast, we always encourage you to keep learning.
Yeah, learn something new. You never know when that new thing you learn becomes a lifelong interest.
Absolutely. We'll catch you guys next week for our talk on mollusks.
Yeah, thank you very much. Glad to see you all. Like we said, keep learning.